Dobro večer, dragi gledatelji, dobrodošli još jedan na 1. Večeras imam naročitu emisiju, naročitog gosta. Blaine Reininger, američki je kompozitor, performer, mnogo što umjetnik koji je odredio moju generaciju, koji je odredio cijelu jednu scenu, ali da ne nabrajam, prvo da ga pozdravim. Dobro večer i dobrodošli.
Thank you. Happy to have. Thanks for having me.
Hvala vam lijepo što ste došli odmah sa aerodroma, doputovali ste iz Atene. Nadam se da je bio let ugodan, sutra ćete imati koncert i hvala vam što ste našli vremena odmah sa aerodroma doći u emisiju.
Thanks for having me again. Nice boring flight.
Recite, vi ste puno puta gostovali, mogu kazati, u Hrvatskoj. Je li vam ostao neki koncert u posebnom pamćenju, sjećanju?
Yes, I was talking before to the people that drove me here. I was here a few times before that, but I was here in 1991 with my colleague Stevenom Brownom, and we were working with a young dancer whose name I can't remember. We were here for maybe almost a month, and this was, this was a time that was right at the crossroads of great change, say. It was before the war, and actually Croatia was something like prosperous at that time and open to the world, and the currency had become a hard currency while we were there. And so we had a Yugo. We rented a Yugo that we drove around, and we were staying in a big hotel next to like a sports stadium. We were there all the time. And so we spent a lot of time here then. And then finally we did a concert here that I remember. And I remember that time fondly. It was actually a very good time.
Vratimo se na početke vaše karijere, jer karijera Tuxedomoona i vaša umjetnička karijera odredili su cijelu jednu generaciju, ne samo glazbenika, nego cijelu jednu scenu, pa i generaciju nas koji smo tada bili privilegirana publika, vas, Joy Division, Cabaret Voltaire, Residence i tako dalje. Ali u prvom redu Tuxedomoona. Kako je izgledao San Francisco tih godina kada ste se vi sreli sa Brownom i kako ste krenuli u projekt? Da li je to bila reakcija na tadašnji Flower Power, na hipije? Što vas je formiralo? Jer vi ne dolazite iz tog okružja, vi dolazite iz okružja zapravo akademije, dakle jednostavno ste se školovali kao eksperimentalni glazbenik, ali jednako tako iz postmoderne tradicije kabareja i ostalih, recimo, teatarskih oblika.
Well, I was educated classically, I played in symphony orchestra and I studied, composition and those kind of things. But I had a parallel career playing in bands. I was playing in bars in Colorado, where I'm from, playing bass, playing guitar, and so I had these two paths that I had taken. So I was not strictly academic, but I also studied art in university, and I became enamored of, of contemporary art in the late 70s and studied that. And also I knew that a lot of the bands at that time were actually coming out of art schools rather than music schools, like Roxy Music or, Brian Eno, David Bowie. They all had a firm background in art. And so when I got to San Francisco in 1976, there was already a kind of an underground surrealist, Dadaist scene. The residents were already there, already acting. There was a group called the Ant Farm. They did a famous sculpture called Cadillac Ranch, where they just buried 6 Cadillacs out in the prairie. And there was always this kind of underground surrealist, Dadaist scene, and I became interested in that first when I moved to San Francisco.
Kako to objašnjavate da je tada East Coast imao tu tradiciju povezanosti sa nečim što je čak u tradiciji povijesnih avangardi? Kad kažete dadaizam, To je jasna referenca na evropsku umjetnost.
I don't really know. I know that in the East Coast, you had figures like John Cale, John Cale working with the Velvet Underground, and these people were studying what's his name, Lamont Young. They're studying with this guy, and these guys are like the direct descendants of the classical tradition. I mean, the classical tradition was taking like a deconstructivist. You know, they were deconstructing classical music, and that kind of bled over into the this nascent rock scene. So you had people like John Cale coming into Andy Warhol's orbit, and John Cale had been a classic pianist. He had played at what's it called, Tanglewood. He dropped a piano from a helicopter. So these elements did kind of intermix. I mean, I think the thing that happened also, for instance, in San Francisco at the time, there was a reaction against what had happened with rock music, that it had become kind of establishment, it had become boring, it had become dull, it had become like free of ideas. Everything was mellow, man. You had like the Eagles and Crosby, Stills and Nash, and so along came these groups, these like punk groups, like from the New York scene, the Dead Boys and the Ramones, and even the Talking Heads. It was a reaction against where rock and roll had gone, and that started to take root in San Francisco. And so there was a club in San Francisco called the Mabuhay Gardens, which was a Filipino restaurant. And somebody talked the owner of that place into having shows of this new kind of rock, this punk rock shows in his place. And they started to have bands there, and people were forming bands just to play in this club, right? People that never played music before. And so there was this upheaval, and there was this excitement about these bands that were coming along, very exciting, very enthusiastic, very different. And people like me and Steven, who were more from a kind of the Dadaist, surrealist kind of school, we blended right in there. We got different haircuts, and we had a different style than we had before, but we fit in really well.
Vi ste se ipak razlikovali, spomenuli ste rezidence. Ja sam također odrastao na rezidencima, imamo isti afinitet. Doduše, meni se commercial sviđa jednako kao Eskimo, a vi ste Eskimo album istaknuli kao vama možda najznačajniji, najdraži, ali kako ste surađivali sa njima, surađivali ste kasnije i sa Snakefingerom, ipak ste se u nečemu razlikovali. Oni su bili više u ovoj tradiciji performansa koji je vezan uz teatar, ajmo kazati u najširem smislu. Vi ste ipak bili klasični bend, iako se volite predstaviti ovo kompozitor i performer. Dakle, kako je to izgledalo tih dana i kakvi su vaši utisci, koja su sjećanja na rezidence?
Well, the Residents were very different from us. The Residents had this kind of postmodern American, like almost comic, The Residents were just on the verge of comedy, right? I mean, they had this kind of postmodern sense of humor, which is not really the same aesthetic as Tuxedomoon. I mean, Tuxedomoon was a lot more serious, really. And that was more other members of the band than me. I was not quite so serious. But we all had this kind of Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Edgar Allan Poe, kind of proto-goth pose in our life, the tragic poet dressed in black, off drinking absinthe. I mean, we all took this kind of French aesthetic on, We always had this kind of European character to what we did. And, me, I speak German, so I was writing songs in German. And, Winston spoke French, and so he was singing French or singing about Camus, and l'étranger, you know, and so we always had that kind of look and that kind of attitude.
Ko je glazbeno, čitajući kroz desetljeća, ko je sve utjecao na vas osobno, ali i na bend, što biste vi kazali, tko je u prvom tom desetljeću formirao vaš glazbeni izraz? Tko je najviše utjecao na vas?
Well, I mean, other than ourselves. Well, you know, I'd have to confess that Bowie had an enormous...
To je kasnije, ali mislim da na početku biste odmah Bowie istaknuli, ne? Već u 70-ima.
Well, I mean, I started playing music when I was quite young. I mean, I started playing the violin when I was 9 years old. I started playing the guitar when I was 11 years old. I was in my first band when I was, 11. And I was in the first band that played for money when I was like 12 or 13. And I was always in a band one way or another. And of course, the Beatles were an enormous influence on me. I mean, when I first saw the Beatles on television, like a lot of people in America, I decided, well, that's what I want to do. You know, I wanted to learn how to play guitar. I already knew how to play violin. You know, and as the Beatles progressed and as they took other influences along, you know, as they were exposed to, like, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and they were exposed to contemporary classical music, and, you know, also their work with George Martin, who was steeped in all of that kind of stuff. And they were part of the avant-garde scene in London. They took a lot of that on, and so that came out of their music. So where I was in the middle of Colorado, you hear that music on the radio, and there was nothing like it, right? There was, you say, what is that sound? Where is that coming from? As, you know, for instance, when they wrote, you know, Revolver, and they're playing backwards, and you hear these kind of sounds. But also, my teacher at the time, I had a very good teacher when I was like 12, and we would go in the morning to his office before class, and he would play things for us. He played like Edgar Varese, you know, and he arranged Ravel for our string orchestra to play. You know, we're all quite young.
Ono što me začudilo je da ste spomenjali, prije nego što dođemo do Bovija, tog prelomnog momenta, da ste spominjali Morriconea.
Well, I didn't find out about him until much later. I mean, I saw those films, and it was, you know, those films, I think I'd say 80% of the appeal of those films, at least to me, was the music more than the acting. And it's true, you see later Sergio Leone movies without Morricone, and they're not that interesting at all. You know, Morricone used strange sounds. He used like amp reverb, you know, and hit the amplifier, you know, and going, 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 and that kind of stuff. And you never heard that kind of stuff in music in those days. But I mean, as time progressed, I found out about, for instance, Captain Beefheart, you know, who was also a great influence on me, not only musically, but, you know, poetically. The kind of poetry that Captain Beefheart appealed to me enormously. So these were, you know, pre-Bowie. I mean, when Bowie came along, I thought, well, here's the next thing that's going to get me really excited. I was already excited by, you know, the Beatles and Captain Beefheart and Pink Floyd and even the Moody Blues. You know, but I liked avant-garde music all along.
Postoji jedna Bovijeva pjesma, Sons of the Silent Age. I po mnogima ona je bolja u vašoj verziji nego Bovijevoj. Zanima me na koje, da, ja volim Bovija, ali mnogi to kažu. Na koji način Bovi utjecao na vaše stvaralaštvo, jer ga zapravo, kad govorite o Boviju, uvijek se referirate na njegovo stvaralaštvo kao prelomno u vašem opusu, poetički.
Well, yeah, when I first found out about David Bowie, I mean, you know, somebody played me some of his early records. as I say, I had been stuck listening to fairly boring music. And I was playing in bar bands in Colorado. And we were listening to things like Ohio Players, you know. We were listening to like radio music or Creedence Clearwater Revival, and we're playing that stuff in bars. And then I heard Bowie. I appreciated his poetry, and I appreciated his obvious intelligence. That was the other thing. I mean, I had come to believe, because of where I was, that rock music was for idiots. You know, because the people around me were all just fucking idiots in these bars in Colorado, you know. And Bowie was obviously intelligent, and that was exciting to me. You know, I said, wow. Because, you know, when I heard the Beatles, it was like a rush. You know, it was like being plugged into the electricity. Like, whoa! It like took over my imagination. And nothing else appealed to me quite like that again until Bowie came along.
Imamo još zajedničkih afiniteta, to je Lynch, recimo. Prije smo spomenuli filmove sa Morriconeom i Leone, ali ajmo još malo o filmu. Postoji jedna pjesma In Heaven, dakle, koja se vezuje, to je legendarna pjesma koja se vezuje s Lynchov Razorhead. Kako ste vi doživjeli Lynchov svijet?
Well, you know, David Lynch got his first really wide exposure in American cinema by playing Eraserhead in a movie house in San Francisco called the Roxy, right? The Roxy Cinema. And it was at midnight movies. And we would go to those midnight movies all the time. And it would help if you were, you know, stoned out of your mind. It would help, you know, I would go stoned and drunk and, you know, high on everything I could find and see this movie, this mind-blowing movie. And it became like a religious ritual to us, and we saw it more than once, you know. It was like DMT experience. It was so otherworldly that it took us all by storm. And that's sort of what launched David Lynch in the world of American cinema, was this reaction from the people in California. And we saw that song in that point in the movie where the woman with the big cheeks is singing that song. So, you know, I thought, well, we should play that song, and then so we did. And, you know, we played that live. I mean, that became known. I sang it. You were talking about the Sons of the Silent Age. I would tell you that maybe one of the reasons behind why people like that cover, I recorded that song shortly after I had been in a big car accident in Amsterdam. You know, I got hit by a car, and it's a long story, but I broke all the fingers in this hand, you know, and also I broke my ankle. And so I was, you know, I was bedridden. I couldn't go anywhere. And I wrote the first draft of that song on a little tape recorder, and I had a little Casio keyboard. And the way I sang it was a lot more kind of poignant. It was a lot more melancholy. It was a lot more soulful and heartfelt, because I was, you know, I had come about as low as I could ever get. You know, I almost lost the ability to play my violin, to play music. I didn't know what I would do, where I would go. And so I recorded that cover, and it has that quality to it, that kind of lost quality.
I treća stvar koju sam htio pitati, treća pjesma, koju sam htio spomenuti kao moguće meni važnu, a u vašem je opusu također istaknuta kao referenca na utjecaje, to je jedna nježna posveta Kraftwerk. Dakle, vi ste napisali stvar Rolf and Florian Go Hawaiian. Zašto...
Oh, yeah, all right.
Zašto su on Kraftwerk bili toliko važni u karijeri i na koji način su oni utjecali?
Well, Kraftwerk influenced everybody, really. Kraftwerk also...
Hvala što ste to rekli, da.
They also influenced, you know, the beginnings of like hip hop, and you know the use by black American musicians using electronic instruments to make music, popular music with a beat. But also, of course, I was at that time. I had also begun to study electronic music in 1976, 77. I was learning how to play synthesizer, how to operate the studio in school, you know, and then around that time, Kraftwerk came out. Also, David Bowie played Kraftwerk before his shows, the Thin White Duke shows. But the music is so pure, right? The Kraftwerk synthesizer sounds are so pure, so clear. And also they have a very kind of innocent attitude, you know. I mean, they have a very kind of, also a very pure attitude about kind of trivial things. You know, say, I listen to the radio, won't it sound so good? You know, and this is my computer, whoa. You know, and we're driving in the car, and we're going to the, you know, we're in the train and having some big fun. And I felt that these guys were innocent and pure, kind of a pure music. And so that's why I wrote this song. It was like, yeah, I thought these guys, you know, are like humble guys from Düsseldorf, you know. I had this idea of seeing them in like a beach movie, you know, seeing Ralph and Florian surfing in Hawaii, you know, with a bikini girl and drinking Hawaiian punch, and, you know.
Vi ste otišli iz SAD-a za Evropu i napustili ste jedan zapad i otišli na drugi. Pa ću sad otvoriti cijeli niz pitanja. Prvo da vas pitam, jel se sjećate ko je bio predsjednik SAD-a tada, i kad kažem da ste otišli na zapad, iz jednog zapada na drugi, postoji li zapad uopće danas? Vi ste u koljevci tog zapada u Ateni već godinama i desetljećima. Postoji li zapad u tom kulturnom, duhovnom smislu na koji se referiramo kad kažemo zapad? No, posebno me zanima, sjećate li se predsjednika SAD-a i možete li komparirati situaciju SAD-a tada i sada?
Well, of course, you know, the president at that time was Jimmy Carter, you know, and then it became Ronald Reagan. And, you know, we saw what was coming. We saw that Ronald Reagan was the thin end of a kind of American fascism. And what we see now is a result of Reagan coming in and undercutting, you know, the social advances of Franklin Roosevelt, and remaking America in this image. I mean, I don't want to get into that a lot because it's a long road to walk down, you know, the decay of the American empire and, you know, the loss of empathy in the American people, you know, the death of love, really, in American culture. You know, I'm out for me, I'm out for my gain, and fuck you, you know, which is the dominant theme in American politics now. Jimmy Carter I thought was a good president. And Jimmy Carter was also a real Christian. I mean, later in his life, he's out building houses for the poor. And you would never even imagine Donald Trump doing that, helping anybody in any way, you know. And so, and is there still a West? Well, yeah, I'd like to think so. You know, I'm a practitioner of Western culture. I'm steeped in Western culture. That's not to say that I haven't absorbed things from others' cultures. I think that's one of the great things about globalism, about globalization, is that people know more about other cultures, and they see, okay, this group of people, they eat this, you know, they think is good food, and people try to say, well, I like it too, you know, and so slowly these kind of foods become part of their diet. And the same thing, well, they listen to this kind of music. I like that music too. I'm going to learn how to do it. I'm going to learn how to play, you know, sitar, or I'm going to learn how to do throat singing, or, you know, how to do African drumming. And that becomes part of their, you know, becomes part of their cultural expression as well. And so there is a kind of a universalism in the world that I think is a good thing, you know, and it should and could promote like universal brotherhood, you know, for people to take. But otherwise, you know, I am a dedicated Westerner. I don't, you know, I don't want to go live in India. I don't want to go live in Egypt, you know. I have a low tolerance for like dirt and disorder, and, you know, I like being a Western man.
Ostanimo na trenutak na tome. Tu su dva motiva. Jedan je vaša apologija globalizma koja mi se sviđa. Vi često branite zapravo ideju globalizma, čak od praktičnih razina, kontakta sa prijateljima, razmjena informacija, uspoređujete to sa situacijom prije 40 godina ili situacijom kad ste došli u Brisel, o čemu ćemo sada, pa i niste mogli biti u vezi recimo sa roditeljima. Ali mi je također zanimljivo ovaj motiv vas kao zapadnjaka. Naime, vi govorite 7 jezika, u ne znam koliko ste velikih gradova Evrope živjeli, ispravite me, ja mislim da je to sigurno 7-8, i to stalno živite pa se vraćate i tako dalje. Kad ste došli u Brisel iz SAD-a, je li to bilo iz isključivo kreativnih pobuda, zbog duhovne klime i kreativne klime koja je bila različita u SAD-u od one u Evropi, ili koje su vas zapravo pod pobude i motivi vodili da se preselite iz SAD-a u Evropu i postanete na taj način zapadnjak?
Okay. I would say that Tuxedomoon had been granted a residency in Rotterdam, in Holland, after we finished recording Desire. And so we were in Holland, we were in Rotterdam for maybe 6 months. We were working, we had our studio equipment. We were writing, recording there. And pretty soon, you know, they got sick of us and wanted to kick us out. And so we needed somewhere else to go. And Stevenom Brownom made a trip down to Brussels. It was the summer. He had heard there was interesting things happening in Brussels. And as things turned out, he met a lot of people on the scene there. And he also met the people who had organized our first show in Brussels anyway, which were the same people that were working with Joy Division, for instance. They were sort of the Belgian licensee of Factory Records. They had a big connection with Factory Records. And so Steven met these various people, and we decided that we'd probably be better off to move to Brussels. And so we found places to live, and we found situations, you know, and we started recording right away. I moved down to Brussels in November of that year, and we were working with Les Disques du Crépuscule in Brussels at the time, and we were given like free time in this recording studio. We were there all the time, writing and writing and writing. We were writing all kinds of new material, you know, and we had a rehearsal space in this converted factory called Le Plan K, which became a famous place, you know. And a lot of the bands from that period were coming there to play at Plan K, a lot of the factory bands, you know, and, you know, Psychedelic Furs and Bauhaus, and they were all coming over to Brussels because of this connection with Factory Records and because of the scene that was there. And also the studios there were a lot cheaper than they were in England. There were a lot of very good recording studios in Brussels. They were much cheaper than England, and so the record companies thought it was, you know, economical to send the bands to Brussels to record. And of course the bands enjoyed coming, you know, getting out of England, coming, you know, drinking beer and meeting the women and all that. And there was quite an interesting scene going on in Brussels in those days. There was, for instance, there was a cafe called Interference, and that was a place that played videos all the time, right? That was what was going on in the early 80s. People were watching videos, even before MTV came out. It was a very trendy place, and they had concerts upstairs. So there was quite a scene, quite an involved scene. And there were a couple of independent record labels there in Brussels that went on to bigger things. I mean, there was one label or a distribution place called Play It Again Sam. And they became, I guess, the largest distributor of records in Europe and in the world. And they had a soft spot in their heart for Tuxedomoon. They let us rehearse in their warehouse on the top floor. So, you know, we were treated well, actually, in Brussels when we first got there, you know. This was a big, we experienced the same kind of thing that Miles Davis experienced when he came from America. I mean, in America, you're nothing, right? You're shit on the floor until you become big, right? But otherwise, who are you? We don't care about you, you know. And then we got to Europe, and it's like, oh.
Kako je sada, kad nakon cijelog jednog života i svih tih utjecaja, kako je sada, dakle, recepcija ili odnos, naravno, kod one publike, sad se referiram i na kritiku i na obrazovanju publiku koja zna dome Tuxedomoona i vašeg opusa. Što danas misle u SAD-u, a što u Europi? Jeste li zadovoljni sa recepcijom cijelog tog svog opusa životnog puta?
Well, yeah, I would say so. I would say so. When we first got to Europe, for instance, the agent that we were working with was putting us in La Maison de la Culture in France. We weren't just playing bars. We were playing these grand, you know. It was Jacques Lang was the Minister of Culture, and so he was open to our kind of thing. And so we played all over the place, all over France in La Maison de la Culture. And, you know, we were also friendly with these people at Actuel magazine in France, which was a big deal. You know, it was very, very trendy. You know, the Actuel studios across the street from Jean-Paul Gaultier's studio. And, you know, I'm sure we met Jean-Paul Gaultier in the course of things. And, you know, we played a show in Paris that was sponsored by Actuel that featured the Jajuka group from Morocco that the Rolling Stones had recorded, right? This huge group of Arab musicians that played all night, really dancing music. And so, you know, Brian Geisen is out there dancing, and suddenly we were accepted by like the Culturati, right? We weren't just like a bar band. People took us seriously and listened to our ideas, and it opened the doors for us. It would not have happened in the United States. Didn't happen.
Stalno odlažem jedno moje pitanje, ajde, koje ću sad ispucati, jer negdje u tom razgovoru ću onako stršati, ali onda ćemo se vratiti ovim idejama, jer moram pitati koje su to temeljne ideje vašeg rada. Ali prije toga ću vas pitati sljedeće. Jako mi je to važno, jer povezuje dvije teme. Vi ste u svim tim gradovima u kojima ste živjeli, naravno, i spavali i sanjali. Vi pridajte tim snovima jako velik značaj. Vodite i dnevnik svojih snova. Čak ste i duhovito objašnjavali kako sad kad ste stariji čovjek se budite više puta u noći pa zapisujete odmah i ne zaboravljate. I pričali ste kako vam posljednjih godina u san dolaze vaši mrtvi prijatelji, pričaju čak na duhovit način ste to, a i oni su u snu duhovitu, kažu, evo, bili smo mrtvi i tako dalje. Koliko su svi ti ljudi odredili vaš život i vaš opus, koliko su kreativno pridonijeli vašem opusu i kako se odnosite upravo sprem tog oniričkog svijeta, sprem svijeta snova kad govorimo o vašoj kreativnosti?
Well, yeah, that's very important to me. I mean, that's something, this is an idea that the surrealists first brought into Western culture, but, you know, it's not, they didn't go very far with it. I mean, this is an idea that also it's also studied and understood in, you know, Eastern mysticism, in, you know, Buddhism and Hinduism, especially Buddhism, this kind of conscious exploration of the dream world, you know, to understand the dreams, to try and to be awake in your dreams, to try and be lucid in your dreams. And that is part of my spiritual quest, my spiritual practice takes place in my dreams, you know, to try and be aware of what's happening, to influence my surroundings in the dreams, and to write down what I experience in my dreams. And it figures all through my work, you know. My work...
A to je vrlo zanimljivo da kad govorite o snovima, govorite upravo toj vrsti, sada očito je duhovne budističke prakse, a vi jeste budist, tako se deklarirate. Vi se opisujete kao, vi ste akter u svojim vlastitim snovima. Što to znači? Vjerojatno će vašim fanovima i svim drugim gledateljima biti puno zanimljivije da sami opišete. Što se to znači da ste akter u snovima?
Well, I mean, one interesting thing about this is I often have dreams where I'm inhabiting a body, being a character that isn't me, right? More than once, I've had a dream which is like the television show Quantum Leap. I don't know if you know this show. It's this guy gets put into another person. You know, he wakes up and he's in a situation, and he's a baseball player, or he's a woman, or he's all different things. For instance, I had a dream once that I was in Frank Sinatra's body, and I was on stage, and I was at a concert. It was Frank Sinatra's concert, and I said, whoa, these people think I'm Frank Sinatra. And so I sang my way. You know, I tried to get through it, but I was not. I didn't know exactly who I was, but I was not Frank Sinatra. I was me. I was another character. And so I've heard some Buddhist teachers say, if you don't believe that your self or your ego is an invention, you know, is an illusion, every night when you dream, you not only invent a new character for yourself, you invent other characters around you, and that's all invented by your mind. It says, so if you do that, you know, 8 hours a night, you also do that when you're awake. You invent your personality, you invent your ego, you invent your history. So that's very interesting. I mean, this is a very basic part of my work. I mean, I invent methods to try and like subvert my ego, right? I use automatic methods. You know, I like to use what they call aleatory methods.
To sam sad htio pitati apropo zapisivanja, zapravo stihova, kažem, ne pisanja poezije, nego zapisivanja, jer vi zarana koristite po uzoru na mnoge druge tu aleatoričnu metodu. U čemu se ona sastoji? Ona se vjerojatno i razvijala kroz godine.
Aleatory, you know, it comes from the Latin word for dice, alea. And that's what it means. You throw a random element into your creation. I mean, the idea is to undermine your ego. You know, your ego and its desires. Okay, I want to be famous. I want to be rich. I want to write a song that everybody's going to hear and give me a lot more money. You know, it's the ideas of John Cage as opposed to Cale. John Cage wrote about these ideas, and he used these kind of methods to undermine this kind of egotistical creation. And so, for instance, John Cage used the I Ching to write his pieces. And so he would consult the I Ching, and he would say, you know, what should I do with this next bit of my piece? You know, should it go up? Should it go down? What should be his character? And he would throw the I Ching for that reason, and he'd come up with his piece. And his piece incorporated a lot of things that people don't often consider to be musical, right? I mean, John Cage sat at a piano and didn't make any sound for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The idea he's trying to get across is everything around you is also music. So don't listen to me because I'm not doing anything. Listen to everything else that you hear, which is also music. And so I use these methods to stimulate my creativity, you know. But I also just love the sound of these kind of random words, this kind of James Joyce randomness in writing poetry. And so I used to use like dice. I invented a system using Dungeons and Dragons dice, like 12-sided dice. And I had like 12 parameters, 12 kinds of words. I would throw the dice, and then I would write the words, and then I would have a poem there. And some of my earlier songs use that method, like on my album Broken Fingers, you know. There's a song that says, "Oh, the days yet to come, we're a tiny radio on the dashboard of infinity." I use that method to write these words. And so now I found interesting computer programs to generate random phrases for me. And you can generate, you know, a meter-long strip of phrases. And you say, "Oh, that's great," you know, "Oh, that's great too. I like that." And then, you know, you naturally come up with your own ideas how to make it read better, how to, you know, that's how I work.
Spomenuo sam ljude, spomenuo sam prijatelje u snovima. Spomenimo sada i na javi ljude, dakle, koji su bili cijelo vrijeme uz vas. Vi se, dakle, srećete još 70-ih sa većinom njih, sa, dakle, Brownom, sa Winstonom Tongom i sada nabrajam. Peter Principal vam se javlja u snovima. Nešto me zanima posebno oko njega. On je sakupljao arhivu benda. Što je zapravo sa tom ukupnom arhivom i ostavštinom? Ko ima kontrolu nad tim danas?
Well, yeah, different people. I mean, Peter was the one that he collected a lot of recordings of the band, or he collected our rehearsal recordings. And so we've gone through a lot of those. I mean, some of those we've published. We have a Bandcamp website, which is live stuff. And Peter had lots of recording. He always recorded, Peter. And so after he died, we started to go through his hard disks. And also he had DATs. You know, he recorded on digital audio tape. And, you know, we've explored a lot of it, but there's an enormous amount yet to be uncovered. Also, you know, I have begun to make like a pastiche of some of these live recordings, you know, to make new assemblies of the things that we did in these long sessions that we had.
Dobro, spominjao sam Browna. On vas je u jednom trenutku ponovo okupio. Koliko je Brown utjecao na vas tijekom karijere?
What, Steven? Well, I mean, well, at the beginning, right? At the very beginning, Steven and I had a mutual friend, right? This friend of mine, he went to where Steven was in Illinois, and he went to live there. And Steven was kind of a local countercultural leader, right? Steven had a coffee house that he like managed, and he directed. And they had like cinema showings, and they had things like that. So he met this guy, and then he came to my town, my friend named Leslie. Came to my town, and he met me. And, you know, I was in a band, and I was editor of an underground newspaper that I published. And, you know, a violinist. And I was known. I was kind of a underground leader also in my town. So I thought, well, you guys should meet. And then, as it turned out, we were both going to school in the same place to study electronic music. Came the end of the year, and we gave a show, a concert of our compositions. And a lot of it was just, you know, wallpaper electronic music. But Steven's piece was very interesting, and my piece was very interesting. My piece was like a multimedia performance, right? It had projections, and I was singing and reading poetry, and Steven was playing on a huge tape loop that generated over and over, but it was all melodic. That's the other thing. I mean, there was a tendency towards melodic music in the Bay Area at that time, away from this kind of concrete music, with melody. And for instance, Terry Riley was teaching in the Bay Area. And so our music was melodic. We had that in common. And so we started to work together. I mean, I contacted him, and we started to work together, and we came up with some very interesting stuff there at the beginning, the Tuxedomoon stuff, you know, it was mutual.
Ok, i sad na tom početku, već ste tada, malo prije sam rekao da ćemo o tim temeljnim idejama riječ dvije kazali da ste imali samo jednu ideju i misao vodilju, da ako je nešto već što ste čuli, čuveno, da naprosto to ne želite kao svoju glazbu. Da želite stvarati ono što se do tada nije čulo.
Well, that's what Steven said, right? Steven said, we don't want to sound like anybody else. But the fact is we sounded like everybody else. We sounded like everything we'd ever heard that we thought was interesting.
Što je vas vodilo? Pustimo Stevena. Što je vas vodilo? Kakvu ste vi muziku htjeli kroz život stvarati i umjetnost? Koje su temeljne ideje?
Well, the basic ideas was to be unconventional. The basic idea was to be, you know, weird. The basic idea was to be psychedelic and strange and Dadaist, you know, and to avoid being as dull and boring as popular music was in the 70s. To avoid being the Eagles, you know, to avoid that kind of music. And so, at least for me, as I told you before, I was already like a disciple of everything weird I'd ever heard. I was already a disciple of, you know, Captain Beefheart. I won't say Frank Zappa because I don't like Frank Zappa, but I liked all these, you know, Wildman Fisher and all this kind of crazy stuff. I liked all of that.
To znači da ipak imate nekako ukorijenjenost u taj West Coast, jer vama prethode i sve ono što smo i mi slušali kao klinci tada, dakle Grateful Dead i sva psihodelija. Kad se kaže psihodelija, dakle imate ipak nekakve predčasnike. Htio bih vas na kraju pitati, jer smo tu na 2-3 minute, da nam kažete riječ dvije o vašem domaćinu. Vi dolazite u Hrvatskoj puta u Pakrac i pozvao vas je episkop Jovan. Meni je to osobito zanimljivo, meni je on drag čovjek, da mogu kazati da smo prijatelji, ali jer se ne znamo dovoljno dugo, ali smo si dobri i izuzetno se rado čujemo i dobro surađujemo. On je i omogućio da dođete večeras u studiju jer sutra svirate. Recite mi, koji je to tip prijateljstva koji vi njegujete sa episkopom Jovanom?
Well, this is a first for us. I mean, we've never been to that town. We've never really met these people. And so this is a new experience for us. You know, I mean, there's one promoter named Dragan that works here. I don't remember his last name. He was like with, what's it called, B2 or B20, whatever. He booked us many times, Tuxedomoon. He's like an old friend of the band, and he's our connection to this Pakrac.
Onda ćemo završiti ovako. Kakvu bi vi glazbu, spominjali ste i nove tehnologije, artificial intelligence posljednjih godina, kakvu biste vi glazbu htjeli stvarati u ostatku karijere i kakvu biste glazbu htjeli slušati?
That's hard to say. I mean, the kind of music I'd like to create is the music I am creating. I mean, I have a new record here.
A ovdje početak i ovo je...
It's called Nine Times. I have quite a few. Actually, in the last few years, I've been very prolific. I've put out, you know, 10, 11 albums with you know, huge albums with like 24 or 48 songs and 14, 15 songs. I have a huge backlog of music So the kind of music I like to make is the music I am making. I mean, one thing is that modern technology has made it possible for me to have my own studio, you know, because I never had enough money to have my own studio. It's not Prince, you know. But now I can go in every day and write songs, you know, on my computer and record, and I do that all the time, you know. I have I don't know if you know Patreon. You know Patreon? I have a Patreon page that brings in some money that, you know, I use that money to buy food and medicine and, you know, guitar strings, whatever I need. And it's a stimulus to me. All my subscribers know and expect to get 2 new songs every month. So that means I have to write 2 new songs every month. And I do, and I have been at least that, you know, sometimes 3 or 4. For the last 3 or 4 years, that means I have, you know, a huge amount of songs. So I'm very pleased with, you know, the situation in my life now, and I'm very pleased with how my work is going.
Hvala vam lijepo što ste bili moj gost. Sutra se vidimo na koncertu. Hvala što ste napravili taj napor da odmah nakon dolaska iz Atene sjednete u studio, jer ste zaista dotrčali, dovezli smo sa aerodroma. Nadam se da će vam biti po običaju dobro u Hrvatskoj i nadam se da će biti dobar koncert. I samo mi recite, hoćete li doći na vrijeme, tako da znam da ostanemo spavati ili ćete...
We're going to be on time. What, you mean tomorrow?
Da, da.
Oh, sure. We're very punctual. There's my colleague George is sitting out there. He knows.
Dobro, znali ste doći...
We're very organized bunch of people.
Dobro, onda mi je to drago da ste promijenili navike. Znali ste doći neki put i par sati kasnije.
Oh, well, when we played in Zagreb some years ago, we were late because the airline lost our Peter's base. That's why we were late.
Sad smo vas i opravdali. Hvala vam lijepo još jednom. Drago mi je da smo se upoznali. Drago mi je da sam upoznao jednog od idola moje mladosti, ljudi koji su u mojim formativnim godinama utjecali na mene. Hvala vam puno i na tome. I vjerujte, ima ih puno koji dijele da imaju stav, mišljenje i to iskustvo. Blaine, hvala puno.
Yeah, I like Croatia. I've had a good time here. Thank you.
Nadam se da će biti i sutra dobro. Dragi gledatelji, gledajte nas i sljedeći puta i do tada doviđenja.